Good morning. Welcome in. The Out of Bounds Show is brought to you by Farm Bureau Insurance. Bundle your car and home and save with your local Farm Bureau Insurance agent. Favorites.com. F-A-V-E. Get a quote in 4 minutes or less. Save right now. F-A-V-E. Favorites.com. This is ESPN 105.9 The Zone. You can watch the show on YouTube. Search Out of Bounds Sports. YouTube, search Out of Bounds Sports. We want to welcome in our friend Brad Edwards. Brad is from here. Grew up here in Jackson, went to the University of Alabama, spent 25 years with ESPN, and covered Nick Saban a big chunk of that time at LSU and Bama. I guess I could say Michigan State, but definitely LSU and Bama. Most of us didn't know who Saban was until he arrived at LSU and disrupted the world of college football and the conference. Brad Edwards, good morning. How are you?
Good morning, Bo. Doing well. Obviously, big week last week. I didn't really see it coming. I obviously wasn't shocked because of his age, and we've long speculated that he'd probably be stepping down within 5 years. But I just always kind of felt like he'd go out after a title. And look, I mean, obviously no shame in losing in overtime in the playoff, but just didn't think he was going to hang it up at that point. But I'm sure there are plenty of non-football reasons that happened.
Did you talk? You know so many people in the industry, Ivan Mizell, Reese, all, and many, many others, writers and broadcasters, and just Alabama friends and alums. Did you talk to anybody in the last 3 or 4 days that y'all had a conversation and kind of hashed it out, Brad?
Not as far as, not as far as like, should we have seen this coming, that type of thing. But more just kind of, looking back over it and just reflecting on, what happened over that span of 17 years that he was at Alabama, and, what were the reasons for his success, and on top of that, all the reasons that we don't expect anybody to ever do it again. And look, one of the reasons that he stepped down, I think, is a combination of his age and his energy levels dropping because of that, as it does for all of us when we start to get old, along with the extra energy it was going to require to be able to keep up with the whole NIL/transfer situation that we now have, where it's not only the 365 days a year that you're recruiting high school kids and now having to evaluate players on other teams as potential transfers that you could bring in, but it's also the, having to constantly continue to recruit all the kids on your own roster in order to keep them from transferring out and going somewhere else. Obviously, there's some of them that you don't care if they leave, but there are a good number of them that you want to make sure that they stay. And look, every coach is having to deal with that now. But my point is, the older you get, the more of a drain that is on you. And even the younger guys are having difficulty keeping up with all that now. And so I don't have any doubt that was a factor in his decision.
Talk about the first time. Okay, you used to do College Game Day on ESPN Radio. So I know you had some interaction, and then he would come up for the car wash too.
Right.
Okay, so walk me through that, Brad, because I heard some people talk about if you got him in the right space, more of an intimate setting, he was great to visit with, and he was engaging and would share things that you could actually share on air or wherever, whatever platform you were using at that moment.
Yeah, so the only conversations that I ever had with him were during the car wash, or when he was in Bristol. As many times as we were in Tuscaloosa, he never spoke to radio. In fact, I believe, actually I have no question, he's the only coach of all the teams we covered who didn't speak to us. And you would think that it'd be like, well, what a jerk, everybody else has time for us, but you don't. But the thing was, he was very transparent about it. And, he wasn't directly, but his PR guy was. And we were never given the impression that we were going to get him. And it really was as simple. And this is one of the things that made him great. Saban was very intentional about everything he did. And he always kind of allotted his time with the idea of, okay, what is going to make me better? What is going to give us a better chance of winning games, both, short term and long term? And, to Saban's credit, he understood that while the fans really get into talk radio, that's generally not the type of thing that very many players or high school recruits are interested in spending their time with. And so, while, sure, they're Alabama fans and fans of college football who may have enjoyed hearing what he had to say, it wasn't going to help him get better players to Alabama. And that's what he wanted to focus his time on. So when we would go to Tuscaloosa, we would be given, a high-profile Alabama player, which was fine for our show, to talk to instead of the head coach. Everywhere else, we would talk to the head coach, but we knew why. And so it was a little different, but at the same time, like I said, it's kind of defines what made him great, is that he thought about everything that deeply that he was not going to waste his time on sports radio when he knew that his recruits weren't listening to sports radio.
Right.
But when he came up to Bristol, there were a few good conversations and fun. Some of those where everybody always thinks about Saban, the guy never smiles, whatever. When you get him in those situations, there would be some grins, even some laughter. And one of the stories that I remember best was Ryan Russillo and I had him. You always usually say one-on-one. In this case, it was a two-on-one interview, and Russillo asked him a great question, which is it's perfect just because he's so well known for his success. Saban is, and it's very rare that he makes mistakes. Obviously, we all do, and he has made a few of them. But he asked him directly. Russillo asked him directly about what's the most memorable instance for you where you did something that you immediately regretted doing. And Saban said, on the field or off? He's like, I'm not sure if I want to answer that question off the field. And so he's like, no, on the field. So Saban didn't hesitate. He said 2001 SEC championship game, and those who are old enough remember the setting, which is he was the head coach at LSU. They were playing against Tennessee. Tennessee had just upset Florida to win the SEC East, and Tennessee needed to win the SEC championship game to be in the BCS championship game, play for the national title. Had to be a double-digit favorite. LSU was probably like a 9-3 team, something like that. But they won the West. So LSU, big underdog, first possession of the game. They have the ball, ends up 4th and inches on their own 20-something yard line. Players are like, let's go, coach, let's go. And Saban said, I listened to the players, and I got caught up in it, and I went for it, and we got stuffed. Tennessee gets the ball on our 20-something yard line, and like 2 plays later, 7-0 Tennessee. And he said, I'm thinking I just blew the SEC championship game for us by doing – and anyway, if you remember the game, LSU came back and won the game. And so Saban's like, they bailed me out. But he said – he just laughed about it. He's like that – he said, I never let the players talk to me anything again after that. But he said that was definitely one where as soon as I did it, or as soon as we got stopped on 4th down and they scored, he's like, I really screwed that up.
Wow.
Yeah. Oh, and hey, the other thing after that, Bo, is that we finished that interview, and there were a few other questions that he enjoyed answering, and he said to us, he said, you guys asked a lot of good questions. He said, all the guys who cover the team, they ask a lot of dumb questions. and I said, Coach, in their defense, when you have to cover a team and ask questions of the coach every single day, at a certain point you kind of run out of good questions. So I said, I kind of understand where they're coming from. And he said, well, there may be some truth to that. But yeah, I mean, like a lot of guys like Saban who just constantly answer questions for a living, even if it's about something that, puts them in a vulnerable spot where they're having to talk about their weaknesses, sometimes they enjoy answering a question that's just different from anything that they've gotten before.
Brad Edwards, 25 years at ESPN, did it all. Joining us on the Farm Bureau Insurance guest line, talking Nick Saban and his legacy and the way that he well, built back the Alabama football program. Brad, I know you knew about Saban at Michigan State. You were a part of ESPN's college football team starting in like 1996. But anybody, I think we program our mind to think that we've always known about Saban. It's just not true. For most of us,
Right.
we were introduced to Saban once he got to LSU and because he turned them around in such a short period of time. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I mean, I do remember him as the defensive coordinator for the Browns under Belichick. But when he was at Michigan State, obviously they won a few big games there, and that's why LSU was interested in him. But when LSU made that hire, I thought to myself, what are they doing? Why would you hire this guy? He's never coached in the South. Obviously, he didn't have a great record. It wasn't like he'd come close to winning the Big Ten at Michigan State. And I was thoroughly confused as to why a guy who had never worked in the SEC would be the one that LSU would go after. And I remember even going as far as to think he can't succeed because he's not going to be able to recruit down there. Well, I think we saw that didn't really make a whole lot of difference. If you got it, you got it, and Saban had it. And it wasn't until I was looking back later, doing some research on him for my book, that I realized that while he was at Michigan State, he basically had a better record against Michigan, Ohio State, and Penn State than anybody else in that league did, outside of those three teams. Of the others that were going up against him, he had beaten them more than anyone else. And I think that had to be part of what LSU had noticed in him, is his ability to be able to win these big games, to get his players to, kind of elevate and play competitively and sometimes win against teams that were more talented than them. Because if you think about the time when he took over LSU, they were a mess. And I don't know that it would be right to say that there were a lot of teams that were way above them in the SEC, but certainly at that point, Florida and Tennessee were.
Yes.
And LSU had to play Florida every year. And so there were reasons that I don't even remember who the AD was at that time at LSU who made the hire, but whoever he was, he obviously saw some things in Saban that I failed to see. And
Joe Dean.
And obviously, yeah, and saw the right things for sure. And so it makes sense that a guy who was a former coach would have noticed that type of stuff.
I think it was Joe Dean Sr. It was one of his last, because he wasn't really a good AD. In one of his last hires, he hired Saban, and then Bertman took over shortly thereafter. I think I have that right, Brad. Oh, let's talk about that. Mal Moore. Yeah. All right, good. Brad Edwards, 25 years at ESPN. He joins us on the Out of Bounds show, ESPN 105.9, The Zone, brought to you by Farm Bureau Insurance. Okay, Brad, Mal Moore, you remember this story. Mal approaches Saban, gets rejected, then goes through like Spurrier and Rich Rod and maybe a couple others, and goes back down and I think convinces Terry Saban, who I think wanted to get back maybe in a college environment anyway.
Yeah,
but tell me what all you remember from that 2008 coaching search where Mal Moore's job is on the line, even though he's a legendary guy and tied to Coach Paul Bear Bryant, but things were not lining up. I think he thought he had Rich Rod at one point. Anyway, walk us through all that, Brad.
Yeah, so what's crazy is to think of like three of the great what ifs in college football history, are connected to Saban ending up at Alabama. The first one of that group is that if you remember when Tim Tebow was being recruited out of high school, he came down, he's talked about this a number of times afterward. His decision was basically between what he ended up doing, obviously going to play for Urban Meyer at Florida, or going to play for Mike Shula at Alabama. And if Tim Tebow had gone to Alabama, I don't think Mike Shula gets fired at the time that he did, because he would have had a highly touted, freshman quarterback. I don't think that they would have been as, nearly as good as Florida was, but they would have been good enough that he wouldn't have been fired after that season, which opened up the job, which eventually came to Saban. So the second thing in the what ifs is that like you said, Mal Moore eventually settled on Rich Rod, and at that point, West Virginia was doing very well. Rich Rod would have been a great hire based on the success that he'd had there, and a deal seemed to be in place. It was one of those like, okay, it's done, and then a lot of people started reporting that it was a done deal, and then something happened at the last minute, and the rumors have always been that Rich Rod's wife said, I don't want to live in Alabama, which is funny because that's actually where they are now. Is that, and look, I don't know whether that's true or not, but that was what ended up coming out of it, is that it was basically she was the one that pulled the plug or talked him out of it or whatever it was, and he backed out at the last minute. And of course, at that point, everybody's laughing and say, Alabama, you think you're all that, but you used to be. You're not anymore, and nobody wants your job. Nobody's interested in going to Alabama. And by the way, the evidence seemed to support that. Especially if you looked at some of their recent coaching hires, and that was when Mal Moore just kind of doubled down and he went back after Saban. And I'm not saying he camped out in Miami, but he essentially went down there with the attitude, I'm not leaving until I know I have exhausted everything in my arsenal to be able to get this guy. And of course, Saban really wasn't completely sold on the idea of going to Alabama. But what ended up changing everything, and this is the third big what if, is that Saban, after 2 years with the Dolphins, knew he needed a better quarterback if he was going to succeed. And he identified Drew Brees as the guy that he wanted. Brees was a free agent. They brought in, actually, I can't remember if I think he was a free agent. I don't think it was a trade thing. I think it was a free agent. And they brought in Brees, and for whatever reason, there was something with I think the Miami Dolphins training staff and doctors would not clear Brees on his physical. They said that he had a problem there, and they weren't willing to give it the green light, and therefore Saban was not allowed to sign Drew Brees. Now, of course, he goes to the Saints, and the rest is history as far as the greatness of Drew Brees. Obviously, Saban knew what he was doing when he wanted Brees as his quarterback, but because he wasn't able to get him, that was one of the things that made him reconsider whether he wanted to stay in the NFL, because quite honestly, he's like, without a great quarterback, all I can do is go like 8-8 every year. I'm not going to be a good coach in the NFL if I don't have a good quarterback. And so that was when he was willing to listen to Mal Moore a second time and consider going to Tuscaloosa. And then, of course, the story is when he finally agreed to do it, they're on the plane and, flying to Tuscaloosa to, make the announcement. And supposedly, I think Saban tells the story a little bit differently, but supposedly Mal Moore said, or that Saban asked Mal Moore, do you think that you hired the best coach, that you can get? And he said, oh, yeah, I do. And Saban's like, I don't know if you hired the best coach, but you hired the best recruiter. And obviously, Saban, everything he did from that point forward would have validated that claim. So that's kind of the way the story went. But like I said, there were three big things that had to go in Alabama's direction in order for Saban to end up there. And if any one of those three hadn't happened, it's not just that Alabama football would have been changed or SEC football would have been changed. It's all of college football history would have changed because of that.
Oh, he's the godfather of modern-day college football recruiting, as you know, Brad. He disrupted with analysts and the way they approached it and adding all, the resources that he had. I mean, we had Tom Luganbill on, and I know you know Tom, Thursday or Friday, and Luganbill headed up ESPN Recruiting forever, and he said, man, this guy totally changed modern college football recruiting.
Yeah.
He did it at LSU, as you know, Brad, to a certain extent, but really took it to another level, several years later at Alabama,
yeah.
right?
Yeah, he did. Yeah, and I'll tell you a quick story on that. Let me think about this. So when Urban Meyer finished up at Florida, remember he sat out for I believe he sat out for 1 year before he took the Ohio State job. And during that time, he worked with us at ESPN on the signing day stuff, signing day coverage. And we were in a meeting. I was working on signing day that year. and we were in a meeting the day before, so the Tuesday, signing day was always on a Wednesday. And Urban was telling a story about when he was at Florida. This is how much respect he had. And obviously, Urban was a really good recruiter himself. But to give you an idea of how much respect he had for Saban's ability to evaluate talent, especially on defense, Urban had told his assistant coaches who were out on the road recruiting that if Alabama has offered a guy on defense, if it's a defensive player and Alabama has offered him, you have permission to make an offer. Like, you don't have to call me and approve. If Alabama has offered him and he plays defense, we want him, right? And I mean, for Urban, I don't know if he's ever told that publicly, but I know he didn't tell that story on air, but he told us in the meeting. At this point, enough time's gone by that I don't mind, telling that story, which was probably off the record. But that's how much respect even Urban Meyer had for Saban's recruiting abilities. And if you think about it, what happened is then Urban, because of the competitiveness recruiting wise and what it took to succeed at Florida, not just all of his time in the SEC, but specifically toward the end after Saban got into the conference, he developed a recruiting mentality that he took with him to Ohio State.
Absolutely.
And he was recruiting. He was doing things. He was basically breaking unwritten rules in recruiting, like before someone had signed, like in the SEC, they're still fair game. If they haven't put pen to paper,
right,
they're fair game. In the Big Ten, they had this gentleman's agreement that, like, if someone's committed somewhere, you don't recruit them. Well, Urban's like, forget that. And so when he got to Ohio State, he started doing these things. It upset a lot of people in the conference, but ultimately they had to make the decision, am I going to change the way I recruit, or am I just going to let Ohio State, dominate the Big Ten for the next decade? And some of the schools, like Michigan, for example, had to come to the decision that we have to change the way we're doing things. And that ultimately led to Michigan hiring Harbaugh.
Yes.
And so, I mean, and that gives you an idea of how Saban even impacted the Big Ten, which is crazy.
Well, I've only got a minute, but you just nailed it. I remember when Bielema, before taking the Arkansas job as the head coach at Wisconsin, complained about Urban taking the job and then taking one of the Wisconsin commits. All right. And down here, we were like, dude, that happens every 5 minutes here. And he and Alvarez were raising hell about it. We were like, man, that's just a Tuesday. That's just a day that ends in Y in the SEC. All right. We got to do this again. And soon. Thanks so much for your time today. Brad Edwards, I hope you're doing well, and Happy New Year to you, buddy.
Happy New Year to you, and keep plugging along, man. It's going to be a fun offseason.
Brad Edwards, 25 years at ESPN, was a part of Game Day, the BCS, College Game Day on ESPN Radio. He's from here. We grew up together, then went to the University of Alabama, and had a hell of a career at ESPN for 25 years. He joins us on the Farm Bureau Insurance Guest Line. The show is also brought to you by RPT and Rick's Pro Truck, RPT in Gluckstadt, Flowood, and RPT Commercial, Jason, in Pearl, right? I mean, look, where do you take your fleet vehicles? You go to RPT Commercial in Pearl. That's RPT Commercial in Pearl, right across from the Skelly Furniture.